Captain Jake Morrison stood at the main window of his ship and watched the stars burn. The emergency signal had reached his ship 3 hours ago, but he still could not believe what he was seeing on the screen. New Geneva Colony was gone. Not destroyed in battle, not lost to some natural disaster. It had been deliberately burned to ash by weapons that targeted homes and schools and hospitals. Lisa Brooks sat at her desk in the communications center and played the final message from the colony again. The voice belonged to Dr. Mary Collins, who had been running the medical center there. Her words were clear even through the static. The Zephyrian ships had ignored every white flag and every civilian evacuation request. They had fired on the emergency shelters where families were hiding. They had bombed the school during the morning assembly when 500 children were inside. 300,000 people had lived on New Geneva Colony. Farmers and teachers and doctors and engineers who had never carried a weapon in their lives. They had built greenhouses and libraries and playgrounds under the orange sun of that distant world. Now there was nothing left but radioactive glass where their homes had been. Jake Morrison had fought in 17 battles during his 20 years in the human defense fleet, but he had never seen anything like this. Wars happened between soldiers and ships in military bases. That was the rule humanity had made when they first joined the galactic community 50 years ago. It was simple and clear, and every species had agreed to follow it. No attacks on civilians, no targeting of non-military installations, no weapons fired at those who could not fight back. The other alien species had thought humans were weak when they proposed this rule. The Zephyrians had laughed during the council meeting and said that real warriors did not limit themselves with such foolish ideas. The Nexari had called it primitive thinking from a young species that did not understand how real wars were fought. But humanity had insisted, and eventually the Galactic Council had agreed to make it official policy. Admiral Pete Sullivan received the full report at his headquarters on Mars Station Alpha. He was 68 years old and had commanded fleets during the border wars when humanity was still learning how to fight among the stars. He knew what this attack meant. The Zephyrians had not just killed 300,000 civilians. They had declared that the one law humanity cared about most was meaningless to them. Pete Sullivan walked to his office window and looked out at the red surface of Mars below. His grandfather had been born there in the early colonies when humans were still struggling to survive on their own worlds. His father had commanded the first human ship to reach another star system. Now Pete himself was about to make a decision that would change everything. The communication came through on the emergency channel that connected all the major human military commanders. General Amy Carter was calling from Earth. Colonel Danny Rodriguez was connecting from the Outer System Patrol. Captain Steve Nelson was joining from Deep Space Reconnaissance. They all knew what this meeting was about. Amy Carter spoke first. She was the highest-ranking officer in the Human Defense Command, and her voice was steady, but her words carried weight that made everyone listening pay attention. The Zephyrian Empire had violated the most basic law of civilized warfare. They had murdered innocent people as a deliberate act of war. The response would be immediate and total. The plan was already in motion before the meeting ended. Dr. Kevin Hayes received authorization codes at the research station buried deep under the surface of Luna. Project Reaper had been sealed away for 30 years waiting for this exact situation. The weapon systems that humanity had promised never to use unless their one law was broken. Today those seals were being removed. Danny Rodriguez began sending coded messages to fleet commanders throughout human space. Ships that had been on routine patrol missions suddenly changed course and headed for rendezvous points near the edge of known space. Cargo vessels that carried supplies to distant colonies were being loaded with military equipment instead. Even civilian ships were volunteering to join what everyone knew was coming. On Earth, the emergency session of the Global Council lasted exactly 12 minutes. President Helen Murphy read the reports from New Geneva Colony to the assembled representatives. The images from the attack were displayed on screens around the chamber. When she finished reading, there was complete silence for almost a minute. Then the vote was unanimous. The declaration of war against the Zephyrian Empire was broadcast on all frequencies throughout human space. But this was not like other wars that had been fought among the stars. This was something different. This was humanity responding to the violation of their most sacred principle, with the full weight of their anger and their technology, and their absolute determination to make sure it never happened again. Jake Morrison received new orders while his ship was still orbiting the ruins of New Geneva Colony. He was to join the main battle fleet that was assembling at coordinates he had never seen before. The fleet would be larger than anything humanity had ever deployed. Ships from every human world and station and outpost were converging on that single point in space. Lisa Brooks finished copying all the evidence from the attack and prepared the final transmission. The recording would be sent to every government and news service and military command in the galaxy. Everyone would see what the Zephyrians had done. Everyone would understand why humanity was about to respond with such overwhelming force. The message was simple and clear. Humanity had asked for only one thing when they joined the galactic community. One basic rule that every civilized species should follow. No attacks on those who could not defend themselves. No targeting of families and children and innocent people who wanted only to live in peace. The Zephyrian Empire had broken that rule. They had murdered 300,000 civilians and laughed about it afterward. Now they would learn why humanity had made that rule in the first place. They would discover what happened when you pushed the most peaceful species in the galaxy past the point where peace was possible. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as humanity prepared for war. Not war for territory or resources or glory. War for justice. War for the principle that innocent life was sacred. War to teach the galaxy that some lines must never be crossed. The Zephyrians had crossed that line. Now they would pay the price in blood. Dr. Kevin Hayes worked through the night in the underground facility that most people did not know existed. 3 miles beneath the surface of Luna, the secret research station had been waiting for 30 years. The scientists who built it hoped it would never be needed, but they knew that someday another species might push humanity too far. That day had finally come. The weapon was called Project Reaper, and it had taken the best human minds 15 years to design. It was not just a bomb or a missile or even a fleet of ships. It was something that could reach across space and time and make entire military installations simply stop existing. The alien species thought they understood human technology, but they had never seen anything like this. Kevin Hayes entered the final authorization codes and watched as systems that had been dormant for decades began to wake up. Computer screens filled with data streams and energy readings that climbed steadily toward levels that would have terrified anyone who understood what they meant. In 6 hours, the weapon would be ready. In 12 hours, it would be deployed against targets that the Zephyrians thought were completely safe. Colonel Danny Rodriguez stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the greatest fleet in human history assemble around him. Ships emerged from hyperspace every few minutes, adding to the growing armada. The massive dreadnought UES Retribution arrived with its escort of heavy cruisers. The carrier groups brought fighters and bombers by the thousands. Even the hospital ships were coming because someone would need to treat the Zephyrian civilians who would be caught in the crossfire. But the most impressive sight was not the military vessels. Civilian cargo ships had been converted to missile platforms. Passenger liners carried marine assault teams. Even small personal spacecraft had volunteered to join the fleet. Every human who could hold a weapon or pilot a ship wanted to be part of what was about to happen. Danny Rodriguez had commanded fleets before, but never anything like this. The alien species had always assumed that humans were too peaceful to wage total war. They were about to learn how wrong they were. When humanity decided to fight, they did not hold anything back. Every ship and every weapon and every soldier was committed to the battle. On Earth, President Helen Murphy met with the leaders of every human world and colony. The vote had been unanimous, but now came the hard part of actually organizing the response. Supply lines had to be established. Civilian populations had to be protected. Most importantly, the message had to be sent clearly to every other species in the galaxy. President stood before the emergency session of the United Colonies Assembly and delivered the speech that would be remembered for generations. Her words were broadcast live to every human settlement and transmitted to alien governments throughout known space. She spoke about justice and about the price of breaking faith with humanity. She explained why the Zephyrian Empire would cease to exist as a military power. The aliens who heard that speech later said they finally understood why humanity had insisted on their one simple rule. It was not because humans were weak or naive about warfare. It was because they knew what they were capable of when that rule was broken. The golden rule of war was not a limitation on human military power. It was a warning about what happened when innocent people were deliberately targeted. Captain Steve Nelson commanded one of the stealth destroyers that had been operating in Zephyrian space for months without being detected. His ship, the UES Shadow, was invisible to alien sensors and had been mapping every military installation in the Empire. Now those maps were being transmitted to the main fleet, along with targeting data for the coming assault. The Shadow network had been active for decades, but most alien governments refused to believe it existed. Human agents embedded in foreign militaries and governments seemed impossible to the other species. They could not imagine how humans had managed to place observers in so many sensitive positions. The truth was that humanity had been preparing for this possibility since the day they joined the galactic community. Steve Nelson received confirmation that all stealth units were in position. 47 invisible ships were scattered throughout Zephyrian territory, waiting for the attack order. When it came, they would strike simultaneously at targets that the enemy did not even know were vulnerable. The first wave would eliminate every major military command center before the Zephyrians realized they were under attack. Ambassador Julia Wright walked into the Galactic Council chamber for what everyone knew would be the last diplomatic meeting before the war began. The alien representatives watched her carefully, trying to read something in her expression that might tell them what humanity was planning. But Julia Wright had been trained for this moment, and her face revealed nothing. She stood at the podium and delivered humanity's final message to the galactic community. The words were formal and diplomatic, but underneath the polite language was a promise that made several alien delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Humanity had tried diplomacy. They had tried economic sanctions. They had tried every peaceful method of resolving disputes. Now they would try war. The Zephyrian ambassador interrupted her speech and demanded to know what right humanity had to threaten the Empire. He pointed out that his people were older and more experienced in warfare than the young human species. He reminded the Council that Zephyrian fleets had conquered dozens of worlds while humans were still learning to fly between planets. Julia Wright waited for him to finish and then responded, with words that would be quoted in history books for centuries afterward. She said that humanity had indeed learned much from the older species about technology and science and exploration, but there was one thing that humans had taught themselves. Sometimes the strongest people were those who chose to limit their own power until the moment when those limits were no longer acceptable. The Zephyrian delegation laughed when she finished her speech. Several other alien representatives joined in the laughter, because they thought humanity was bluffing about their military capabilities. The humans had always been so concerned with protecting civilians and following rules that the other species assumed they were not serious about fighting real wars. They would not be laughing much longer. In less than 24 hours, the largest military operation in galactic history would begin. The Zephyrian Empire would discover what happened when you broke the only law that humanity truly cared about. 300,000 innocent people had died on New Geneva Colony. Now an entire civilization would pay the price for that crime. The first strike came without any warning at exactly midnight Galactic Standard Time. Captain Roy Phillips watched from the bridge of the UES Shadow as the Zephyrian military command station simply vanished from his sensors. One moment it was there with its defensive shields and weapon systems active. The next moment there was nothing but empty space and scattered debris floating where 5,000 enemy soldiers had been. Working just seconds before, Roy Phillips had been waiting in the asteroid field near Zephyr Prime for 6 weeks. His stealth destroyer was invisible to enemy scanners and had been mapping every target in the system. When the attack order finally came through the encrypted channel, he almost felt relief. The waiting was over. Now came the part that humanity did best. Across Zephyrian space, 46 other stealth ships fired their weapons at the same moment. Military bases that had stood for centuries disappeared in flashes of light that bent the laws of physics. Command centers buried deep underground were reached by weapons that seemed to ignore solid matter. Orbital defense platforms broke apart as their hulls were torn open by forces that Zephyrian science could not explain or defend against. Admiral Tony Garcia received confirmation that the first wave had been completely successful. Every major military command post in the Zephyrian Empire had been eliminated within the first 10 minutes of the attack. Enemy fleets scattered throughout their territory were now operating without central coordination. Most of them did not even know that the war had begun. The main human battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zephyrian home system. 2,000 ships appeared at once in a display of force that would have been impossible for any other species to organize. The massive dreadnoughts formed the center of the formation, while smaller vessels spread out to cover every possible escape route. Nothing would leave this system without human permission. Tony Garcia stood on the bridge of his flagship and opened a communication channel to every Zephyrian vessel in the system. His message was broadcast in their language and transmitted on frequencies that would reach every military unit and government building on their homeworld. The terms were simple and non-negotiable: surrender immediately or be destroyed. The Zephyrian response came from their largest battleship, which moved forward to challenge the human fleet. Its commander apparently believed that his people still had a chance to fight their way out of the trap. He was wrong about that, but Tony Garcia decided to let him discover his mistake the hard way. The human weapons that struck the Zephyrian battleship were unlike anything the aliens had seen before. Instead of explosive missiles or energy beams, the human ships fired projectiles that seemed to phase in and out of normal space. The enemy shields had no effect on weapons that could bypass physical barriers entirely. The battleship broke apart in sections as its hull was cut by forces that its designers had never imagined possible. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos led the 3rd Marine Division down through the atmosphere of Zephyr Prime in dropships that moved too fast for enemy defenses to track. Her mission was more complex than simple destruction. Every military target on the planet had to be eliminated, but every civilian had to be protected. It was the most difficult type of operation possible, but humanity had been training for exactly this scenario for 50 years. The Marines landed in the capital city while overhead human fighters destroyed every Zephyrian military aircraft before they could take off. Tank battalions that tried to move through the streets were stopped by precision strikes that left the surrounding buildings completely undamaged. Enemy soldiers who surrendered were taken prisoner. Those who continued fighting were eliminated. With surgical accuracy, Maria Santos watched her troops advance through the government district while civilian families were evacuated to safety zones that had been established in parks and schools. The Marines carried translation devices that allowed them to communicate with frightened Zephyrian civilians and explain that they would not be harmed. It was a promise that humanity intended to keep no matter how difficult it made the military operation. The fighting lasted for 18 hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. Human technology was simply too advanced and their planning too thorough for the Zephyrians to mount any effective resistance. Every military installation on the planet was captured or destroyed, while the civilian population was protected by the same soldiers who were dismantling their government. Across the galaxy, other alien species watched the battle through their intelligence networks and could not believe what they were seeing. The humans were fighting with a level of precision that seemed impossible. Military targets were eliminated while civilian areas just meters away remained untouched. It was warfare conducted with surgical skill rather than overwhelming brutality. The Galactic Council emergency session was called by the Nixari representative who demanded immediate intervention to stop the human attack. The Stellar Confederacy called for economic sanctions against humanity for conducting unauthorized military operations. Several smaller species suggested that the Council should send peacekeeping forces to protect the Zephyrian Empire from total destruction. But Thenox 7, who had served on the Council longer than any other member, spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed dozens of galactic conflicts. He reminded the assembled delegates that humanity had warned everyone about the consequences of targeting civilians. The Zephyrians had ignored that warning and murdered 300,000 innocent people. Now they were facing exactly the response that had been promised. Dr. Monica Lee arrived in the Zephyrian system with the medical relief fleet that followed behind the main battle force. Her ships carried supplies and equipment to treat wounded civilians and establish temporary hospitals for anyone who had been injured during the fighting. It was another example of how humanity conducted warfare. Even in their anger, they maintained their principles about protecting innocent life. The Zephyrian government tried to negotiate a ceasefire, but their communications were answered with a simple message from Admiral Garcia. There would be no negotiations and no compromise. The empire that had murdered civilians would be completely dismantled. Their military would be permanently dissolved. Their leaders would face trial for war crimes. The only question remaining was whether they would surrender peacefully or continue fighting a war they could not possibly win. Reports from the battle reached every major government in the galaxy within hours. The message was clear and unmistakable. Humanity had demonstrated military capabilities that no other species could match. combined with a level of precision that protected innocent life even during total war. They had kept their promise about what would happen to anyone who broke their one sacred rule. General Billy Thompson walked through the smoking ruins of what had been the most secure military bunker in Zephyrian space. The fortress had been built deep underground with shields and armor that were supposed to protect it from any weapon known to galactic science. But human weapons did not follow the rules that alien science understood. The bunker had been opened like a flower, with its walls peeled back by forces that worked at the molecular level. The Zephyrian High Command had been meeting in the deepest level of the complex when the attack came. Their bodies were found at their conference table with no signs of violence or explosion. They had simply stopped living when the human weapon reached them through 30 meters of reinforced metal and energy barriers. It was a demonstration of power that sent a clear message. To anyone who might be watching, Billy Thompson studied the scene carefully because he knew that representatives from other alien governments would want to see the evidence later. The Zephyrians had thought their leaders were completely safe in this underground fortress. Humanity had reached them anyway without harming a single civilian in the city above. It was precision warfare taken to a level that most species did not think was possible. Captain Lisa Martinez commanded the orbital blockade that surrounded Zephyr Prime with hundreds of human warships. Her orders were to prevent any ship from leaving the system, but also to ensure that every alien government could monitor what was happening. This was not a secret military operation. Humanity wanted the entire galaxy to watch and understand what happened when someone broke their most important law. The trial of the Zephyrian leadership was broadcast live on all communication frequencies throughout known space. Judge Advocate General Sam Johnson had been chosen to conduct the proceedings because of his reputation for fairness and his knowledge of galactic law. The charges were read in both human and Zephyrian languages so that there could be no confusion about what was happening. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Video recordings from New Geneva Colony showed Zephyrian ships deliberately targeting civilian areas. Communication intercepts proved that the attacks had been ordered by the highest levels of government. Medical records documented the deaths of 300,000 innocent people, including 15,000 children under the age of 10. The Zephyrian Emperor stood in chains before the court and tried to justify what his forces had done. He claimed that the civilian casualties had been unavoidable during a legitimate military operation. He argued that his empire was simply fighting war the way it had always been fought among the stars. He insisted that humanity had no right to impose their moral standards on other species. Sam Johnson listened to the defense arguments with the patience of someone who had presided over many war crimes trials. When the emperor finished speaking, the judge responded with words that were later carved into monuments on dozens of human worlds. He explained that civilized species did not target children and families and innocent people, no matter what kind of war they were fighting. Civilization meant choosing to limit your own power in order to protect those who could not protect themselves. The verdict was announced after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all charges of genocide and crimes against sentient beings. The sentence was death for the emperor and his senior commanders. Life imprisonment for anyone who had participated in planning the attack. Complete dissolution of the Zephyrian Empire as a political and military entity. But the real judgment came from Admiral Jennifer Davis, who spoke on behalf of all humanity. Her words were transmitted to every government and news service and military command in the galaxy. She explained that this was not conquest or revenge but justice for the innocent people who had died. The Zephyrian Empire would be replaced by civilian governments that understood the basic rules of civilized behavior. Colonel Tracy Adams led the technical teams through every Zephyrian research facility and military installation in the system. Her orders were to download every piece of information about their weapons and tactics and strategic planning. All of it would be shared freely with any species that honored the golden rule of war. It was both a gift and a warning about what humanity was capable of when they decided to act. The interrogation of captured Zephyrian officers revealed the location of secret weapons programs and hidden military bases throughout their territory. Human strike teams were dispatched to eliminate these facilities before they could be used against civilian populations. The operation was so thorough that within a week the Zephyrian military had been completely dismantled as an effective fighting force. The reparations demanded by humanity were calculated based on the economic value of every life lost on New Geneva colony. The amount was staggering but non-negotiable. Former Zephyrian territories would pay compensation to the families of the victims for the next 50 years. The money would come from military budgets that would no longer be needed. Since the Empire was forbidden from maintaining armed forces, President Murphy delivered her final address about the war from the memorial garden that had been established on the ruins of New Geneva colony. Behind her were 300,000 white stones, each inscribed with the name of someone who had died in the attack. Her words were simple, but they carried across space to every world, where thinking beings lived. She said that humanity had not wanted this war, but they had been forced to fight it by those who thought that innocent life was cheap and expendable. The galaxy had learned that humans would go to any length and pay any price to protect civilians from military violence. It was not a threat, but a promise that would stand as long as humans existed among the stars. The new galactic order that emerged from the ashes of the Zephyrian Empire was built on the foundation that humanity had established 50 years earlier. The golden rule of war became the central principle of interstellar relations. Any species that deliberately targeted civilian populations would face the same fate that had befallen the Zephyrians. Other alien governments rushed to sign treaties that formally recognized the protection of non-combatants during warfare. Military academies throughout the galaxy began teaching courses on precision warfare and civilian protection. The human way of fighting became the standard that every civilized species was expected to follow. The message had been delivered with overwhelming force and absolute clarity. Humanity would tolerate many things from their neighbors among the stars. Different forms of government and strange cultural practices and even territorial disputes could be negotiated and resolved through diplomacy. But there was one line that could never be crossed. Anyone who deliberately harmed innocent people would face the full wrath of the most implacable species in the galaxy. 5 years after the last Zephyrian warship had been destroyed, Ambassador Richard Stone walked through the corridors of the new Galactic Council building on Harmony Station. The massive structure had been built with contributions from 47 different species, all of whom wanted to demonstrate their commitment to the principles that humanity had enforced with such devastating effectiveness. The golden rule of war was no longer just a human law. It had become the foundation of galactic civilization. The former Zephyrian territories were now a collection of peaceful republics, governed by civilian councils that had been elected by their own people. Richard Stone had spent the last 3 years helping to establish these new governments and ensuring that they understood their responsibilities. The transformation had been remarkable. Without the massive military spending that had consumed half their resources, the former empire had become prosperous beyond anything their people had ever known. Captain Nancy Ford commanded the UES Protector as it patrolled the trade routes that connected the former Zephyrian worlds to the rest of the galaxy. Her ship was one of dozens that maintained the peace in this region, but their job had become surprisingly easy. The new civilian governments were so grateful for their freedom from military rule that they competed with each other to be the most law-abiding members of the galactic community. The children who attended school on these worlds learned about the New Geneva Memorial as part of their required education. They studied the names and faces of the 300,000 people who had died and tried to understand how such a terrible thing could have been allowed to happen. Their teachers explained that civilized beings had a responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves, and that this responsibility was more important than any military advantage. Dr. Paul Rivera worked at the Interspecies Medical Research Center that had been established with funds from the Zephyrian reparations. The facility brought together doctors and scientists from dozens of different species to work on cures for diseases that affected multiple forms of life. It was exactly the kind of project that became possible when military budgets were redirected toward helping people instead of finding new ways to hurt them. The research center was located on the world that had once been the capital of the Zephyrian Empire. The massive military academies and weapons factories had been torn down and replaced with hospitals and schools and libraries. Former soldiers had been retrained as teachers and doctors and engineers. The planet that had once exported violence throughout the galaxy now sent out medical supplies and educational materials to anyone who needed them. General Amy Carter reviewed the monthly reports from human military commands throughout the galaxy, and was pleased with what she saw. The defense fleet was stronger than it had ever been, but it no longer stood alone. 43 alien species had requested training partnerships with human forces. They wanted to learn the precision warfare techniques that could eliminate military threats while keeping civilian populations completely safe. The joint training exercises had become some of the most impressive displays of military cooperation in galactic history. Human commanders worked alongside alien officers to practice operations that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Ships from a dozen different species could now coordinate attacks that targeted only combatants while protecting everyone else in the area. But the most important change was not in military tactics, but in the way that different species thought about war itself. The old idea that civilian casualties were inevitable during conflict had been completely abandoned. Every government now understood that deliberate attacks on non-combatants would result in immediate intervention by the coalition of species that supported the Golden Rule. On Earth, President Greg Palmer stood before the Global Assembly to deliver his annual address about the state of human relations with the galaxy. He spoke about the progress that had been made in establishing lasting peace and the responsibility that came with being the species that had enforced that peace. His words were broadcast to every human settlement and transmitted to alien governments throughout known space. The president explained that humanity had not sought to become the guardians of galactic morality, but they had accepted that role when other species proved unwilling to protect innocent life. The burden was heavy, but it was one that humans would carry as long as necessary. The alternative was to allow the kind of atrocity that had happened on New Geneva Colony to occur again somewhere else. Ellen Parker maintained the memorial database in the archives beneath the rebuilt colony. 300,000 names were stored in the computer systems, along with biographical information about every person who had died in the attack. School groups from across the galaxy came to visit the memorial and learn about the price of abandoned morality. Each visitor left with a better understanding of why some lines could never be crossed. The memorial garden itself had become one of the most visited sites in human space. The white stones that marked each grave were arranged in patterns that could be seen from orbit. Messages of condolence and promises to honor the dead came from species that had never even met humans before the war. The universal recognition that innocent life was sacred had become the one belief that united all thinking beings. Jake Morrison had retired from active military service, but he still visited New Geneva Colony every year on the anniversary of the attack. He walked among the memorial stones and remembered the faces of people he had known who died that day. The colony had been rebuilt, but it was different now. It was not just a place where humans lived and worked. It had become a symbol of what civilized species would do to protect each other. The galaxy was at peace, but it was not the peace of weakness or indifference. It was the peace that came from absolute certainty about what would happen to anyone who threatened innocent people. Somewhere in the void, human ships waited patiently for the next species that might be foolish enough to test the only law that truly mattered to the people of Earth. The universe had learned that humanity was not the strongest species, or the most advanced or the most numerous, but they were the most determined when their principles were challenged. Other species might fight for territory or resources or political advantage. Humans fought for the idea that civilization meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. That idea had become the foundation of a new galactic order where war was still possible, but mass murder was not. The Zephyrian Empire was remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happened when military power was used without moral restraint. Their former territories prospered under governments that understood the difference between strength and brutality. The stars themselves seemed to shine brighter, knowing that among all the species that traveled between them there was one that would never allow the innocent to suffer for the ambitions of the powerful.